So I guess if we get started, if people want to ask questions, just put them in the YouTube chat. And if you want to actually come on, talk to Ian and David and myself, then join the Discord channel and have a conversation with us.
Okay, so shall I start?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for attending this seminar. It's going to be a series actually of talks. So I figured that because it's quite quiet at the moment, what we could do is take advantage of the time everyone has, and we're going to talk to a few of the industry experts on varying subjects. So today we're going to start with a look at color science, as we term the talk Dave's actually going to present is called Color Chaos, and it's an introduction to color science. And the term color chaos will become apparent through the talk. So basically, I should start by introducing it in a way by saying cinematography is one of the few art forms that's so closely driven by technology. And so when new technologies come along, there's opportunity with that, but also there can be a compromise and there can be hidden problems which people should be aware of. And as you well know, as budding cinematographers, you can't necessarily take what the manufacturer says as truth. You need to find out for yourself. So the importance of testing things and working out what works for you has never been more important when these new technologies kind of emerge. I like to study the old kind of sort of masters of cinematography, like people like Jack Cardiff and Victoria Storaro, who were very interested in color. And Jack Cardiff particularly, he was one of the first cameramen to get registered to use the Technicolor system. And you have to kind of be able to master technology, but then also try and apply it with an artist's eye. And that's kind of very true of the new LED technology that we're going to talk about today. This new LED technology opens up a whole new world of opportunity, but it needs to be understood. You need to kind of understand the weaknesses and the strengths to be able to use it creatively. So we're coming kind of from a world of relatively stable into this world of color chaos. So traditionally with tungsten and HMI lights, it was actually quite a stable, full spectral response color, and then we use different variety of color gels to get a kind of consistent response with them. And now we got this amazing RGB LED technology, and as I say, with that comes some problem. So I guess this is a good moment to sort of hand it over to Dave, so he can explain to you the whole kind of depth and breadth of this situation. So Dave, are you there?
Yep, I'm ready to go. Thanks, Ian. So yeah, this is a talk we normally do live, so hopefully it will read well as a slideshow, over the airwaves. So basically, to set this up, I need to really do a bit of basic color science for those people who've forgotten their time in the classroom. And then we'll run into the principles of white light. So before we start, what we normally do when we're doing this live is run a little film that was shot by or under the auspices of Jeff Boyle from CML, which some of you may know. And it was a camera test that he did using a bunch of different cameras, but the two constants in the film are a tungsten light, which is the very first bit of footage for each camera, and the second bit of footage where you see the color changes slightly depending on the camera will be an LED. The tungsten light and the LED light do not change. I would say that any test like this is only aspect of an LED system, but it begins to show you the variation of color that each camera sees in comparison to the tungsten source. So its response to the same LED is very different from each camera. So hopefully you'll see that. I'll run that now. The first camera, as you can see on the screen, is the Alexa, and it's the Alexa shot with tungsten. And as here we start going, we can see there'll be a color change, and that's LED. It's not really important what LED it is. It's just an industry LED, and this is a C200 with tungsten, and then that's the LED. And here's another Canon, tungsten and LED. Fuji with tungsten, and then LED. So the lights haven't changed, they're still the same lights. It's the red, LED, and the Monstro with tungsten and LED. So Venice. I think this is the final one, and LED. So yeah, so the main point about that is you can see the big variation of responses each camera has. And this is without dimming the LED or doing anything other than just running it at a fixed Kelvin temperature. So anyway, that is basically the chaos that people deal with every day on set. And it varies depending on the LED source, the camera, and the setup they're using as to how many problems they have. But there's no fixed rule to any of this. And that's why we call it color chaos. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about the principle of full spectrum white light, how we measure that light with meters and indexes and the different indexes that are available to us. The differences in white light spectrums, how different spectrums behave and how some work better for us than others in photographic terms. Understanding color gamut on various devices and how that affects us, especially when we're using gels or color effects. And the challenges of color matching between manufacturers of lighting. But before we go into the full bit of that, I'm just going to run through a little bit of color science, just so we're all up to speed. So what is light? So what light is basically electromagnetic waves that all start, which are broken down into nanometers. And visible light, as you can see from here, runs from 400, it's shown as basically 400 to 700 nanometers. And that's what our eyeballs see, the cones in our eyes pick up. Outside of that, we have infrared on one hand, on the right-hand side of that diagram, radio waves, so FM, radio, TV. On the other side, we have X-rays in the blue and the purple, or ultraviolet end of the spectrum. But that little tiny slice is all the energy encompassed in visible spectrum that we use to see the world. And that's what we're trying to reproduce with, originally with film emulsion and now with digital cameras. So we describe visible light through a chromaticity diagram. This is quite an old version. There are more modern ones, but it suffices what we're doing today. And it shows basically the diagram on the left. You can see my pointer here. This diagram here shows RGB, shows the white line here, this white curve in the middle. And it's basically, this is the visible spectrum. This is what the human eye range of nanometers we can pick up that we're sensitive to with our eye. And here is a spectral scale looking at it in a linear format, showing full spectrum light. And that's what the human eye perceives from 400 to 700 nanometers. So we start with natural light, which we would say would be sunlight, obviously, or potentially tungsten or incandescent light. And we could see that that would be represented. These are very crude, by the way. It's just to give you, to fill in any knowledge gaps that some of you may have, just keep you familiar with where we're going. So when we talk about full spectrum light, we're talking about a light that does have any peaks or valleys or any spikes and holes. So if we look at the metal halide light underneath, you could see that we would, if we film with that, we would find that those holes and peaks would produce some very interesting colors on, for example, skin or in anything we were shooting. Fluorescence, you can see this is a T8 fluorescence, particularly broad spectrum fluorescent, and that would traditionally LEDs had a lot of problems with being used in cinematography. And it wasn't until Kinoflow started engineering phosphor that they really came into use in the film industry. And you could see here that on the right-hand side, the difference between a commercial fluorescent in crude terms and a full spectrum fluorescent, and how much phosphor has been added to create a full spectrum light. So when we talk about gel colors and effects colors, we need to understand the difference between additive and subtractive color. So additive is where we take a red, green, and a blue light, for example, and shine them at an object to create a hue, or if we do them equally with pure red, green, and blue, we ultimately end up with white, as you can see in the middle of the left-hand diagram. Subtractive is gelling, so where we take a traditional light in our industry and we put gel on it. Ultimately, we will get loads of different hues depending on what we're holding back. And ultimately, if we do that with pure red, green, and blue, we'll end up with black, not letting any light through. So that's subtractive lighting. So another way of looking at it, that would be additive. So that's what we're doing basically with LEDs. We're taking pure color LEDs or RGB in many cases and mixing it to make gel colors. And ultimately, we get different hues depending on the amount of energy we're putting out of each diode, and we're getting anything up to white out of them and all the hues on the way, or variations on the way to white. Subtractive with gel is where, quite simply, it's everything where a gel is only emitting the spectrum. It's like a filter, it's a bypass. So it's only allowing the spectrum that it's designed to allow through onto the object. Everything else is held back, which is why gels fade, and it's why they, dark blue gels on a tungsten light burn out quickly. It's because they're holding back more energy and heating up. And if we look at the left-hand one, you can see as we keep adding gels, figuratively in this, we end up with black in the middle because we're just basically taking all the light away. So this is quite an important diagram to understand when we're talking about white light. This is the Planckian locus, and for those of you not familiar with it, it is basically the natural white line, and it's basically, if we take a filament light, put it on a dimmer, it's obviously black before we put any energy in it. And as we start to heat the metal up, it starts to radiate, and it comes in very warm and red. And as that heats up, you can see, hopefully this works, that basically as you get to white, you see the ball running around along the line. So that is basically what happens to any black body radiator. It'll run along this natural white line, which we call the Planckian locus. And the other name that we use for this is black body. So a black body being the filament and the Planckian locus being the natural white line. So the interesting thing about this is that almost all traditional sources that we use for photography sit on this line, and this line's not a straight line. So the sun sits down around the 6,000s, around 6,000 Kelvin, obviously, and tungsten around 3,000, but they're on different points of the line. And basically, what happens as we heat up any black body radiator, and if we could put the dimmer on a dimmer on the sun, it would do the same thing. We basically follow this line, and what's modulating is green and magenta. So above the line is green, and below the line is magenta. Any of these intersecting lines will give us a Kelvin reading, but it may have a huge difference in response on any film capturing process that we're using, film or digital, in terms of its green or magenta content. So that is the Planckian locus. And let me just run through.
Dave, do you think it's worth pausing at this point, maybe, to see if anyone has questions? Because we can't stress the importance of understanding the Planckian locus to what we're going to move on to talk. What you're going to move on to talk about, right? That's really important that everyone grasps that concept.
Sure. Yeah. If anyone's got any questions.
Yeah, if anyone's got any questions, you can unmute your mic and just talk, basically. If not, if you don't want to talk, then you can type in the seminar questions chat at the top, or if you're watching via YouTube, in the YouTube chat.
So while that's going on, maybe I should just comment on it, Dave.
Yeah, sure.
My understanding, because I'm not sure if I have, but my understanding is that that Planckian curve represents the way the human eye sees white light changing from different kelvins, which is like from a tungsten warm light through to a daylight blue light.
Well, it is the way that your eye perceives it. It is the natural white line. So it's what happens in physics. You know, it's based on physics of light, of white light. The point of this is really, in terms of being cinematography, is that the camera and film stock and cameras are all designed on line. So if you, for example, if we took a tungsten light and we put a gel on it, so, you know, a quarter blue, we're going to, you know, for example, if it was at 3000 Kelvin, that particular tungsten light, and we put a quarter blue on it, in the old days, as technicians, we would have thrown that quarter blue on it, or our gaffer would, or whoever, and it would have taken the blue down here. And the green magenta modulation would have been done in the lab at Lee Filters. They would have done that work for you. The difference is that this bend here needs to be accommodated when we start playing with white light. We need to accommodate that shift in green and magenta.
So, for example, how that would translate to kind of like LED technology would be that, say, a cheaper LED units wouldn't stay true to that curve. Is that what you're saying?
So typically, the first ones I worked with, and the very first ones, because obviously we Kineflow very closely, were bicolor. So this is going back 4 years or so. And though we had at the time was considered a very good tungsten and a very good daylight, although we've moved on with those chips now, they basically, when you blended them, so you wanted to get to 4000 Kelvin, as you can see from the picture here, that the journey was a linear journey, and you would undershoot the Planckian curve, and therefore the camera you're on would pick up a magenta hue as you were trying to maybe express daylight with a quarter blue or a half blue kind of correction, but just by using the dial on the LED fixture. Yeah.
And to recap, just so people understand the relevance also of the images you showed originally with the Jeff Boyle showing different skin tones with different camera settings, and the difference between a tungsten light and an LED light. So presumably these LED lights, I think it was a leading manufacturer he was using as well, wasn't it? It wasn't necessarily.
I don't think the point of that film was to out anyone or good or bad. It's really, it's a problem for every manufacturer, in terms of how do you line up to every single camera, and that's something I'll get to at the very end of how it's been addressed. But
so that example earlier of people seeing the slight magenta or green hue on the skin, was this?
That is not this problem. That problem is evident while the LED is sitting somewhere around here in a fixed tungsten position.
Right.
So you're gonna add to that problem once you start trying to blend it, or if it's a bicolor, if you start trying to correct blue into it, or modulate the color temperature, that's where this will then exacerbate that problem.
So even if a manufacturer can get the exact true full spectral white without any weird casts at a certain color temperature, there's no guarantee that when they if it's a bicolor light and they're moving that color temperature, then that's going to stay true to that curve, right? So
correct. And it becomes really difficult to test, because like Jeff Boyle just did a great test, actually, which the results are coming out of again, similar to the test we just looked at, and it's an independent test, lots of different cameras looking at them in daylight and tungsten. So he's done a test with specific manufacturers, and he's got the results for each LED chip. And one LED is be sitting here for the test at tungsten, and the other one sitting at daylight. The trouble is, it's very difficult for someone like Jeff to then put all the extra hours in to actually test all this functionality within the fixture when you start playing and modulating with the light.
Okay, good.
And no one's ever done that test. I mean, it's not a test. I mean, we do those tests in-house, but we also, you know, working with Keenaflow, they're very concerned about it. But it's not something that's really out there as information you can garner from anywhere.
Right.
So it's only directors of photography and gaffers who are really interested in getting it right who are testing this kind of thing.
And just to sort of explain to people that sort of the problem of this is that, and you're going to come onto this later, I think, Dave, but I might as well just sort of bring it out for discussion now, is that when you come to lighting skin tones, and I've been caught out by this before, when I did a beauty job and I used too much ND, glass ND in front of the camera because I was using really hot lights. I was lighting hair and I was using a really hot light to try and get the specular shine for the hair. And by doing that, I had quite a lot of ND on the camera, and it had a green hue to it, the ND, and I had this green in the hair, couldn't get out later in the grade.
Yes, but then I would ask if you putting. Sorry, Ian, you broke up a bit.
Yeah, sorry. Did you understand?
Yeah, so if you're putting ND on the camera, then you're basically NDing the whole image. So the green would have been something in front of the actual green on the hair would have been
so
something.
that would have been an added.
Yeah, because it's in relation to the rest of the image.
Yeah. However, with LED, if there's bits of information completely missing that you'll come to later, then that's something that you can never get back in the grade, right? It's missing.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's about spectral integrity, and that's another issue that, so, if understood, you know, can be mitigated, or you can work your way.
So the idea that having correct skin tones is something that can be fixed later is not always the case, right? So when we're talking about these color shifts that are happening, when it comes to lighting your main artists, this could be a really significant problem, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem, and people have had their fingers burnt, is you know, as you move from rental house to rental house, pick up maybe the same models, the same instruments from different places, that the aging of the color, there's no uniformity, there's no consistency across product ranges, you know, across particular models, because there's a number of issues such as degradation through heat over time, batching issues where LEDs are all slightly different. When you start dimming them up and down, they all start falling apart, so they end up being very different again. Plus, you've got this natural or unnatural phenomena coming into play as you start dialing in color. So, you know, it is chaotic unless you know what you're doing.
Yeah. So, Jake, do we have any questions that have come up yet?
Indeed. We've got 3. So, Chris Hallam asked, if LED lights have a high CRI rating, they will stay true to the planking line? Question mark.
No, because a CRI is only given color rating. I mean, I'll get onto that in a bit, so I'll go into it a bit deeper. But to answer that question, is CRI is only taking a reading at any one. So it's only good for the point that it's taken. When you start changing, when you start dialing from daylight to tungsten, it's going to, each time you stop and take a reading with some kind of meter, CRI meter, you're going to take a reading at that point, and it will be whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
So Nick Malkin asks, how does the amount of power in terms of a HDMI bank change its color, temperature, and hue?
In terms of a what bank?
HMI.
Well, HMI is a slightly different animal, and they've got a fairly decent spectrum. And when we first had HMIs, they were inconsistent, and we used to mark up on the back of HMIs, you know, any plus or minus green we needed to put on at the beginning of a shoot. So we'd actually, and it was basically a green magenta. And each manufacturer had a slightly different Kelvin look or feel to it, or spectral output. So with an HMI, it's basically they're fairly clean, but aging and other issues come in. So, and basically, generally, if you dim them down, because a lot of HMIs will have a small dimming range, you'll generally disrupt the color quality as you dim down, from my experience.
Cool. Nicholas Hine asks, what tool can we use to check our existing LEDs? C700?
Yeah, there's a C700 or the new one, which I'll get onto. And that has limitations, but the Seconic is a good meter. So I'll get onto that.
Cool. And we got one more. Has there been, so it's Cine in the 6, has there been any consideration to calibrate a multicolor LED lamp to adjust its plus and minus green automatically so you can adjust its CCT to keep it on the curve?
Yes, so that's the work that Kinoflow started doing originally when they first designed their full color LEDs, is they automatically track this curve. And I believe, although I've not tested, that there are a few other products on the market, but that's been one of the goals of Kinoflow, is to get their whites so they're very consistent and clean, and they track this automatically. And they're now at a point where you can add green or add magenta. You can go plus or minus green, and they'll still track the Planckian curve with that bias. So you can add 10 points of green and still track the curve.
Perfect. That's everything at the moment.
Okay.
Could I just ask something very quickly? Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just going back to what was being asked earlier about the ND issue and the green light. I didn't quite hear because it broke up slightly. Where that green was actually coming from. Was it caused from the ND and using the lights much higher, or what was that? Sorry.
Yeah, it was basically a bit of a rookie error. I was using because ND. I don't know if you. I mean, I was using Tiffin ND. That's relatively good quality ND, but over time it has a kind of green cast, sometimes a magenta cast, so it kind of ages not so well. And I think I was using old ND, and that's what created the green cast. But as Dave mentioned, that was an additive problem, which basically meant that there was more. I don't know. I don't really fully still why grade, because you would think that you would just be able to grade that out, but we couldn't. We had real problems with that, and it caused me a lot of stress. But with as you come on to here, with the LED, the problem with the greens cast, the magenta cast you get with LED, is that sometimes it's a spike, which would be similar to the green ND problem I had. In other words, it'll be an additive, more green added to the image. But sometimes it can be a dip of completely missing information, which produces a color cast, which means there's literally a vacuum of information, which means that when you get to the grade, you can't do anything about it. So that's the point I was trying to make earlier, was like the difference between having a color cast from something additive to missing information completely.
Great, thank you. And just to clarify as well, sorry, with fluorescence, when you mentioned the spike of green, I take it that's in like when you have like fluorescence in shops and stuff. Am I right in saying that gives you a green spike? Before mentioning that.
Well, basically, all LEDs have mercury vapor as their primary source. It ignites the phosphor coating. In fact, I've got an image of a really old light coming up, which from the 1901. That precurses the fluorescent, but that green spike is evident in every single fluorescent. What Kinoflow did is in the mid 80s is they took that and they started working with a guy called Mitch Bogdanovich, who was Kodak's colorist, and he gave them all the spectral information from Kodak film stock. So they started designing their phosphor blend to balance out that green spike. So, I mean, to this day, the Kinoflow spectrum on that was a very nice continuous spectrum and became an industry standard. And it's actually a more complete spectrum than an LED spectrum as it stands at the moment.
Interesting. So is the spike still there, but it's just been blended to kind of been hidden more? Is that what you're saying? Or has it actually been taken out?
I'll go back quickly. One sec. I'll go back to here. So if you see this green, okay, these are not accurate. Okay, these are just ripped off the internet somewhere. See if that's the green spike here. Can you see my cursor on your screen?
I can now. Sorry, it just froze 1 second. Can you just wiggle it? Sorry.
Yeah, there.
Yeah, there we are. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so that's the green spike. So basically what Keenaflow did is they put a magenta block in. So it balanced that green. So you had a green magenta, had a green spike and a magenta block balancing each other out. So basically they were equal. And that puts you back on the Planckian curve. Right.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it.
So if you remember the old fluorescence, I mean, if anybody remembers that when you turn an old fluorescent bank on an old Keenaflow, you had to wait 2 or 3 minutes for it to warm up to get to color temperature. That was the magenta block heating up and start. It takes a few minutes for it to start phosphating and produce enough light to balance against the green, and that's what it was about.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. So hold on, I'm trying to catch up with myself quickly here. And so we got here, we're so linear. I think probably run through some of this. So this results in a magenta cast, obviously, and its worst place is around 4,000 Kelvin. By blending RGBs, we can then start tracking it. So this is basically natural white light. The first thing we need to do to start representing white light, tracking this line accurately to give, to stay true to white as the camera sees it. Okay, so every camera like film stock. So this is just really the point here is that when we first started using Keenaflows way back, they were basically had two choices. They had Fuji and Kodak. They designed their phosphor base based on Kodak because it was predominant film stock at the time, and you can only point a gun at any one target at any one time. And Fuji, which had a more sensitive green layer, had a different look. They did actually design it so it was biased towards Fuji to a degree, but it was certainly more biased towards Kodak, which was the predominant stock. So now we're in a world of electronic cameras, and we're aiming our lights at, as you saw from that beginning film, many, many cameras, many more that were in the test. And they're all like a different film stock. So that's really difficult for the lighting manufacturers to deal with. So which one do you aim at? I mean, the original whites we did with Keenaflow, with the first full color ones, are the spectrum is designed to really fulfill the requirements of the Alexa, with a slight, nod of the hat to the other cameras as well. We don't want it looking awful on the reds or on other cameras, but you can only aim at one camera at one time. And when I say what we're trying to do, we're trying to match tungsten with the LED. The two standards are daylight and tungsten. Tungsten being the hardest to hit because all digital camera chips are native daylight, and they use algorithms to get into their tungsten position, and therefore it's harder for the LED to hit that for a number of complicated reasons. In the old days, lights were all full spectrum, which Ian mentioned before, and we didn't have any of these issues. So, but lights historically harmonized, just something we found. 1901 Cooper Hewitt mercury discharge system. These were actually mercury vapor. They put out a bluey green light. And they had orthochromatic film. The trouble with these is they gave you a suntan and they could give you retinal burn. So in between takes, the artist would put yellow sunglasses on to knock out the spectrum. But they put these things a few feet away from the actors, and they're frightening. The actors wore makeup that would pick up the spectrum as well. They'd use green makeup. And each one of these bulbs had up to 1 pound of mercury in it. And wow. To light it, you tip the light, draw the mercury down to the anode, and then you pull it back and it would draw an arc stream, and then it would then sit flat or in its position with an arc sitting there. So it was on a pulley system, and it was a mercury vapor light. So basically that mercury vapor light is really the precursor to phosphating or coating the inside of the bulb with phosphor to create fluorescent. So that's sort of like a pre-fluorescent, if you like. But we're talking about a film industry that were using extremely slow film stocks with a very limited, chemistry arsenal of film stocks to work with. So it was pretty tough conditions. But again, people were trying to create images that resonated on screen, and so makeup was huge. In order to make people stand out, they would overpaint, darken the eyes so that the eyeballs stood out, and all kinds of stuff. If you start going and having a look at it, it's quite an interesting time, cinematography. So LEDs are. Sorry,
Dave, just ask, when did they phase those lights out then? Because
I think about 1920 they start. I can't remember the name of the chemical, but they came up with they basically invented emulsion that started having red sensitivity, and then they moved, and then also they figured out how to put phosphor
from morphochromatic to panchromatic film.
Panchromatic was the next step, yeah. So that was breakthrough, if you like.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then obviously they could get away from. So that was quite helpful too.
Yeah.
LED lights are discontinuous spectrum. So they are a challenge because they are discontinuous. And you have, on one hand, you've got discontinuous spectrum in the light, and then all the cameras have a different response curve. So that is where we see that difference in response in the film, is none of them match each camera in the same way because they're all moving targets. So, so we have, a number of tools to measure this. And, I think we mentioned the Seconic earlier on, which is, if you can see my cursor, this one here or this one here, which I think is the best one on the market at the moment from my point of view. I'm sure people could argue with me or have a different view on that. But it has a lot of different measuring indexes on it, and I'll run through those. But the issue here is that, the first point we make is all of these old to the Seconics, all of these cannot really be used with modern lights. They're really aimed at they're really aimed to be used in a world of continuous spectrum. So they have very limited spectral reading ability. And if you try and use them on anything modern, they just won't give you any relevant information. So you just put them on the shelf and look at them as a piece of history. You really need to move on to something that has a spectral, as you can see on the front display here, has a spectral readout to get any kind of information out of it that has any meaning. And even then it's limited, and I'll go into that. Okay, so none of the handhold meters color correction response. The closest would be the Seconic 700, 800, which uses average spectral responses of an HDSLR camera. So basically, when you build a camera, you have to give it, a spectral response curve, and you have to base it on something. And they based it on HDSLR cameras. Most of the people I work with are working with cinema grade cameras, Canons and Sonys, what have you, with CMOS sensors, and none of them would we consider being similar to an HDSLR camera. Well, we know they're not. We can look at the response curves. So the meter itself is not starting from a place that is really relatable to, say, an Alexa. Having said that, it does have some data on it. So someone mentioned CRI earlier on. So it's quite an old index. This goes back to the 70s. It's basically photopic, which means it was really designed for the human eye. The very original CRI index was only 8 swatches, but they moved it up to 15 latterly. But the Academy of, I think it's MPAS in America, have decided to discontinue using this in the film industry. Inadequate for measuring LEDs. Okay, so that's CRI. So that's really not something that most manufacturers will be quoting going forward, or should be. Here's another index, and this is another one you get off the Seconic, is the IES TM 3018. It's similar in principle to the CRI, but instead of 8 to 15 colors, it's using 99 colors. So it has much higher fidelity, and the outer circle on the ring here is your base source, and then the inner circle will be what you're measuring. Here we're measuring a very good quality LED, so it's very similar, and it's giving an RA of 93, 100 being perfect. So, you know, we know that's a good source.
Dave, what would it look like if you had a not so good source being?
Well, I normally have my meter with me when we do this live, so, and we can pull it out. But this here would be very jagged. So if you took a mercury vapor, weird shaped inner circle, you know, it would reach right down onto the second and third circles and areas and have some weird spikes in it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. So basically, it's a move on from CR. Easy to use, 0 to 100, as long as your primary white or basis of this is HD. You know, it can be useful measuring the differences between two sources. But it doesn't give you, and this is the whole thing about, give you any actionable data for a cinematographer on set, because even if you see that you're slightly out in one area or another, it's not the camera you're on, so it's not relevant to that. And B, if you were to try and filter some of the issues out, they're so fine, there aren't in the world, or there aren't adjustments on the lights you can make to actually mitigate the problem. So, you know, it's very, very difficult to see what actionable data you can get from this type of instrument.
So could you sum up by saying something like color meters can only reference to the sensory response they were designed to reference and not beyond that? So they have a very, like you said, quite a limited use because they can only reference.
I think what they're useful for is measuring bad sources. They're not so good at measuring good sources because you're talking about a degree of fidelity that they're designed to show or give you any data you can use. But if you walk into a warehouse and you want to see what the spectrum is up there, you know, it'll give you an idea, and then you get some just magenta lights you've got. There are some functions on that meter I think are really exciting, which I'll get into a bit later, which is the XY facility it has. That comes on a bit later. Let me just run through these so we can move on. This is, so TLCI, Television Lighting Consistency Index, was designed by an ex-BBC boffin called Alan Roberts. Really a good system for measuring cameras, a response, spectral response for cameras, but it is, again, it's an average spectral response based on a number of different cameras using CCD and CMOS sensors. So it's not going to be specific to the camera you've got on set, and therefore it doesn't really give you actionable data in that sense either. But it's a much better, I mean, it was a huge march on from CRI when it was introduced. And you can see here, if you have a look, you can see that there's an outer swatch, which is perfection, or the reference source, and then the inner swatch is the source you're measuring. And then yeah, sorry.
Was that a question?
I don't believe so.
No, okay. So TLCI, and that's available on the meter. SSI, so Academy of Motion Picture and so on. Yeah, MPAS is who I was referring to. This is on the meter as well, on the Seconic. And this is spectral similarity index. So the theory here is you would take a wavelength, an idealized wavelength. This is tungsten. And it's based on a spectral reading of that. I personally think this is an idealized tungsten lights, and they don't even match it completely. So it's an idealized tungsten source. And then you would put an artificial source over the top of it. So that's a typical LED spectrum. And they will calculate a difference, similarity difference between the two sources by looking at the offsets between the two lights. And that will end up giving you a value. And high values indicate predictable rendering by most cameras. Low values may produce good colors with a particular camera, but not with others. What I think the problem with this is that it's not really giving you any data that relates to a camera, because the source that we're measuring here, we know source, one of the best on the market, and we're getting a huge offset through this calculation, which assigns a very low value to it. But we know if we do a camera test, that's not the case. So this needs some work in my view to make it relevant to shooting, or to use it for shooting with. But it's another system, available on the meter. So if we have a look here, this is the same source bed. All the different indexes are reading it, reading the same source. And CRI, okay, it's meant to be out of use, is giving us 97.2. TLCI is giving us 97, so that's, they're kind of agreeing there. SSI is giving us a 71, but we know with camera tests it's not, it shouldn't read that low. TM80, 18 indicates the year it was introduced, gives us a 96, or a gamut of 103, so we're slightly overproducing in some areas, which is fine. But all of those all agree, but SSI doesn't. So I'm not quite sure where they're going with that, but I guess it's a work in progress.
Cool. I've got a couple of questions if you want to.
Sure.
Are modern sensors more sensitive to a certain Kelvin light?
Modern sensors, well, in terms of camera, the camera sensor, they're, from my experience, and I haven't done any specific, but my experience, that you start off in a better place if you can shoot daylight for spectral reasons. The sensitivity of the camera itself is, whether, X lumens in tungsten versus X lumens in daylight is, do you get more? I would suspect the daylight would perform better, but I haven't done a test myself.
The other thing to mention is in both film stocks and cameras, the blue and green layers are sharper than the red layer. So if you oftentimes when you want a very crisp, sharp light, it's better to go for HMI over tungsten. Even if you take the optics and eliminate them from the issue, it's just a question of the color of the light, and which is going to produce a sharper looking image. The HMI or daylight balance will always look sharper than tungsten. So that's I think a lot of the sensors are more daylight balanced than tungsten because of that fact, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that could be true. Yeah. I mean, that probably.
And that's also true of digital as well, not just film.
Yeah.
Apparently, the red sensitivity is just the softest.
Yeah, red has always been the hardest part of the spectrum for phosphor-based lights, and also for the camera manufacturers. It's more difficult to produce good reds, which we'll get onto.
Yeah, you often get that kind of orange problem rather than getting a rich red. You get orange, don't you?
Yeah.
Burnt orange.
Yeah, we'll be looking at some Kodak film stock in it. So,
was there another question, Jake? Was that it?
No,
was there any other questions?
There's a couple more, yeah. So Coco says, Frida was talking about this at Camera Mage, and I came to the conclusion that a solution would be if camera manufacturers share their color science. Is this a realistic scenario? And is it actually possible that a light manufacturer make their LEDs look the same on every sensor by adjusting profiles?
Yeah, so we'll get into the second question a bit later on. It's a good question. So when Frida started out in the 80s, he went to Kodak and they gave him spectral curves for Kodak film stock, which he gratefully used, and actually ended up hiring Mitch, the colorist, to work with him, as a consultant on designing the phosphor. If you go to, and Frida's done this, he's gone to every single camera manufacturer you'll name and asked them if they'll share their data with him, and none of them will. It's just the world has changed since film emulsion, since Kodak and Fuji. They won't share that information anymore. They've all got it locked down as proprietary information. So, it would make everyone's life a lot easier if they did share it, but then, so, where we go from there, I don't know. So basically, Frida's solution to that was to measure the cameras himself. So, and so in terms of, so the problem is then that Frida spent a lot of money, and then, he's not sharing that himself now because that's commercially, one of the things that he's invested. So, any more? Does that answer the question?
From Young Lou, could you talk about the relationship between color temperature and CRI? When I look at the spectrum of a tungsten lamp, I find that its blue ratio is relatively low, but it still has a 99 CRI.
Yeah, so we can look at it on this chart. So CRI is talking about, so basically, if we take daylight, it doesn't matter, daylight or tungsten. If we take daylight, we're looking at, if we look at what the eye sees for CRI, that would be this top bit. I don't know how well you can see that on your screens. Find an obvious one like this blue one here. You could see my cursor. So that is what the eye sees. And if that's blue, 100%, 100 blue, okay. Camera 2 is recording that blue at this tonality. Camera 1 down in the left corner is recording it to this value, and camera 3 on the right hand side to this value. So they're all seeing this blue slightly differently. So they all get a different score on that swatch, and each swatch has a score, and that score makes up its CRI reading. So it's about the spectral integrity across all the colors within the scope of CRI that gives you a value of 80 or 90 or 100. If they were all doing exactly what the eye saw, they would get 100. It would be a perfect light. But where they start falling down is and what we use the score to do is to evaluate how close to what the human eye can see is, any particular light source is.
But even
Does that answer the question?
Dave, even if something has a high CRI value, another lamp of the same CRI.
I lost you there a minute, Ian.
So even if something has a high CRI value, the same color-wise as another light with the same CRI value.
Sorry, you're breaking up a bit, Ian.
Let me try again. So even if a light has a high CRI value, it doesn't necessarily mean that another light with the same CRI value look the same.
No, because they could have different values in, the same values in different swatches, for example. And the other thing, what CRI doesn't do, it doesn't measure enough of the spectrum to give you a full, overview of how good that spectrum is when you're measuring an LED, because it's not enough. It's only 15 swatches as opposed to TM30, which does 99.
So the problem with CRI is it's quite a kind of it's not a way that you can standardize your color control on a film set, because even if lights have a relatively high CRI, which we've been sold to believe, or we've been told to believe that that means that the light's kind of faithful to color reproduction, the spikes and the valleys that light shows that gives it a high CRI will be different to another light that has a similarly high CRI, but will have different spikes and different valleys.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, it's too coarse to be of value in the modern world with modern lighting instruments, which is why MPAS have all agreed, the manufacturers who are on that committee have all agreed to not use it anymore. But
Right.
I guess lots of people will still use it because they used to know it, you know, and it's relatively straightforward to understand. But TM30 is a much better jump forward if we're going to be empirical about it and just look at straight measurements of, you know, values and that, you know, on this criteria. So.
All right, we've got a couple more.
Yeah. Okay.
XY coordinates could be a good standard to match lights and tell cameras what to do.
Yes, definitely going to get you closer. And they'll it also has another great function as well, which I'll get into. And yeah.
So does the C700 have IES TM 3080?
I've got the 800 and it has all of the look. I'm not sure 700's missing a few. I think it's missing SSI, which I wouldn't worry about because not complete enough information yet. It's not the 700 doesn't have XY, which we're going to go into. So it's missing a few of the indexes, but I'd have to see which ones it has.
No worries.
But I upgraded mine because it was missing XY, and that was the thing I wanted because I think that's really interesting.
Should I use RGB light or rely on gels?
It depends what you're doing. I mean, I'll go into quite in detail in a minute, and it really depends what you're trying to do. And there's two. It's not just one answer for that. It's, you know, it's a decision you should make based on what you're trying to achieve. So, you know, we'll get into it.
Cool.
Any others, Jake? Or
That's
okay.
Thank you.
Custom spectrometer using camera spectral data. So Keenaflow had a problem with this, and this is where we go into a bit of Keenaflow science in specifically. They developed their own spectrometer, and Mitch Bogdanovich was part of that, and they've actually hired his son full time, who's another scientist, to work within the company. So they developed their own spectrometer. So they could measure cinema cameras in order to design lights to work with the particular camera chips they wanted to work with. So basically cinema cameras. And this is basically what their spectrometer looks like when it's in full flow. We're measuring a Keenaflow chip here, I believe. At 2700 Kelvin. And we can see we've got a few. So that's a calibrated spectrum. So we have raw data and we calibrate that. And we end up with what we recognize as anyone who looks at this stuff as an LED spectrum. We look at an XY position on the black body curve. So this is basically tells us we're sitting on the Planckian curve here. And what's great about this is we can plug in 3 cameras at a time, and with the drop-down menus, which I can't show, you can change these cameras up. And in the examples I show, we will be changing them up. So it will show that one light source the response of a single light source on 3 different cameras at one time. So then we have a PA, which is a photographic rendering index, PRI, he's named it, and it can show an averaging of all the different colors that they've got in their system, which are the cameras they've defined as being the critical ones for measuring camera response curves. And then on top of that, the other important element of this for us is the magenta and green response values camera, because the CCT can sit on quite a large intersection across the Planckian curve. You can have big variances of response in the magenta green area, and one light source will have very different response on each different camera. That's one of the things we'll be going into. So just so you understand what we're trying to do here, so a few graphs of interest. This is what we see, human eye sees. So this is photopic or the eye response curves. And we can see here we have a red response. That's our red cone with some exposure in the blue area. We have a nice big fat green response, presumably for walking around in jungles, and a narrower blue response. And the way our blue cones perceive eyes obviously relates to monochromatic vision at night, where we lose a lot of our color response. And this is 400 to 700 nanometers, roughly, is human vision at the bottom.
Dave, while you're on this subject of our primal response to color, and the reason we see more sort of shades of green than blue, for example, is it worth mentioning about skin tones and how we're kind of programmed to notice small fluctuations in skin tone?
Yeah,
on the primal.
Yeah. So do you want me to go into that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting, for me, that's particularly interesting.
Right. Well, I mean, the thing is that we all, one of the things, we all work in bubbles. So when we're sitting on a set, we're looking at the monitor that we have on the set floor, whatever it may be, and we look at an image and think, oh, that's fantastic, which is great. But once we go into the real world, we go through into the, or wherever, we're no longer alone, and we are going to see the flaws. So I work, for example, a good way of explaining this, I work with fashion houses who are trying to sell online commercial sites. So they're trying to sell fashion, a Burberry, for example, would be a company. Not that they're particularly involved in this, but some of the web shop guys are actually more concerned with this, where you've got people shopping on their iPad and they're using their finger to actually scroll through the internet, and pick what they're going to look at and buy. Now, what we know is that when you look at anything, as humans, we look at something, it takes 100th of a second for that image to hit the back of our brain, which is a primal part of our brain. And that part of our brain is the brain that is fight and flight. Sorry. It makes our body move, and it makes our body move before that image hits our conscious brain. So basically, you've got someone.
Reptilian brain.
Yeah, it's our reptilian brain, right? Yeah. So basically, if you've got someone online, shopping online on an iPad, they see something they don't like, their finger's going to move before
they consciously know.
They've even understood they've looked at the image.
Yeah.
Right? So one of the things about skin tone is that, and we know from other scientific studies, that if you add green or if you take color away, we are primitively programmed to understand or to pick that up. We're very sensitive to that, and we will be telling ourselves, or our eyes are telling us, that person's ill, there's something wrong with them, and our initial response to that is to push them away, literally to get away from them. So if we're doing online shopping, we're trying to sell clothes through models, photography that of skin and clothes together. If someone looks ill, the finger's going to move before they've even clicked on that image, whether they like the. And that's something that, if you're doing commercial work like, is critical, because you really want to make people look lush and healthy most of the time, unless you're doing a horror movie. And that color reproduction, I'm sure Ian can tell you more about, is really important and very subliminal.
I mean, color reproduction in, like you said, you mentioned fashion, skin tones, obviously, like you're saying, if anything's slight green in the skin, then you might think they have jaundice or something, or yellow. And that will be an interesting, an immediate repulsion that you're not maybe, like you say, consciously aware of, because it's like engaging that reptilian part of the brain. And then particularly if it comes to, when we do I do a lot of food photography as well. So obviously with food, if there's any strange colors in food, then your primal response to that is not to eat it, because it could give you food poisoning, for example. So all of these things, they operate on such a kind of, they operate in the background, don't they, as a kind of part of our DNA. And we're not consciously necessarily aware that's the case. And that's what I find interesting, is that it's not a conscious choice we're making. It's all primal early brain kind of reaction.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So, and there's two further points that if you're missing in the spectrum. So if you have a light, you shine it on an object, and it's missing energy, you can't recreate that energy. It doesn't come back in. You can't gel it back in. It's just not there. So if you're missing a bit of red, you're not going to expose that portion of red that is naturally in skin. It's just skin's going to go grayer. It's just going to become deader.
Yeah, that's right. So this is a very key point for me, and that's why you got to have very confidence in whatever technology you're using to light your hero, your main artists. Because like you say, if the skin goes grey, then that could be a problem that you could never, you can't get back in the grade. And like you say, these things that you don't always notice on set, but it's, until you get to the grade in the dark room and you see the image and you can see that there's something not right with the skin. And then it could potentially be too late to correct.
Yeah, and the other point to understand about, working on set or working in any environment is that the human brain, in conjunction with the human eye, automatically white balances. And when you're in a dark room, in a dark set, you can't objectively see that very easily with your eye. We used to do a thing when we had spiked green bowls for doing green screen that we'd use on big features. We'd put them in a studio, turn them on full, and we'd talk to people about color spectrum and stuff. Completely different talk to this. We'd then open the windows and the world would go completely magenta, because our brains had spent the last 10 minutes trying to white balance to green. And so you can't trust necessarily what you're looking at on set at any given point, unless you're using a reference. You need to use a reference point really to help your brain see white properly.
Yeah. I love that idea you had a while back about having a white reference box that you could bring on set with you and have that reference that you could use. You could even film it as a kind of white reference wherever you were.
Yeah, well, we did that years ago. We built one for film that people use so that they could send the first frames of any reel off to the lab, so that the lab wouldn't take over deciding on how to grade a film or how to time a film. Would say, this is it. I've shot this scene warm and I've done this because that's what I want.
Yeah.
I don't need you neutralizing it or putting your own interpretation on it.
We'll get into this later. This is a very obviously quite a heavily technological talk here, but when we get to the end of the technical aspects, then we'll talk a bit more about how it can be applied to the creative kind of aspirations we have. Because the thing that really excites me about this is just once you have that stable white reference and you can design your colors around that, then you really are into a world of far freer color kind of control. And that's the bit that I think is super exciting about this technology.
Yeah. Okay.
Should we just stop? Just check we got any more. Is there any more questions that materialized since we've been speaking?
No, I haven't got any through.
No. Okay. Good.
So yeah, I guess we're all good. But yeah, if anyone has any, just let us know.
Okay.
So here is daylight. So this is Kodak film stock, and you can see here with the photopic behind it, with the human eye response behind it, you can see, and people love this stock, but you can see how far off the red is here. And that's why we always did tests before we shot a film, to make sure all the costumes and everything, the color response was going to work. Anyway, so that's daylight film stock. This is a very good digital camera. response curve, and you can see how close that is. Pretty much. I mean, the green's a bit narrower, but it's really good, and people love that camera and its color response. Here's another electronic camera, and you can see how different it is to the first electronic camera.
I'm surprised no one's asked the question. What was it?
I'm not telling what I'm not saying. Don't do that. And here's yet another one. So the point is not what's good or bad. The point is that they're all different. And I think that's really the issue. If you know what you're doing, you can work with that.
Yeah.
So understanding gamut, I'm sure many people know this, but I'll just run through as quickly as I can. So the gamut refers to the entire range of colors available on a particular device, such as a cinema camera, lighting fixture, projector, or monitor. So everything has a gamut, including lights now, which you could argue they didn't in the old days, although you could have given them a gamut. So I'm sure many people know this one.
Rec 709, by any chance?
So common gamuts. So we've got Rec 709, which is, I don't know how much, I mean, I think it's in the high 90s, the amount of editing is done in Rec 709. Only very few films are done in 2020, theatrical release to my knowledge, but you know, I'm sure someone will say I'm wrong, and the world's changing anyway. P3, digital projection, and then we have Rec 2020. We've got ACEs, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. And a camera may have a wider color gamut than can be displayed or projected. So at the moment, Rec 2020 being the largest potential we have for displaying any images we've shot. So digital cameras can capture a very wide. The gamuts of cinema cameras can vary. This in combination to spectral sensitivity. So this is all from Kinoflow's work. So they, having designed a way of measuring cameras and their spectral response curves, they could then derive gamuts out of them. And we can have a look here. And here's a gamut, and here's another one. And these are all camera gamuts. So you can see they're all very different. And you can see the challenge when you're designing anything to conform to all is it's difficult.
Hang on, the big yellow gamut is a camera gamut.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, these, as far as I know, Kinoflow is the only people who've actually done this stuff at the moment.
And they haven't released it, they haven't specified what cameras they are. They just released.
Well, we kind of know, but we're not allowed to really. We
Yeah.
honestly, you know, it's not really. We're not trying to say this is good or bad. You know, we're just trying to say this.
No, I get that, but it's very interesting that I'm intrigued by the big yellow camera, basically. Right. Anyway, carry on.
Well, you go on. You can take a guess.
Yeah.
I won't say anything though. Okay, so film gamuts. So that's Rec 2020, and this is tungsten film stock, and that's daylight film stock. So what's interesting is that they're actually all within Rec 2020 pretty much. Slight little bit down in the blue and a little bit in the green. But
can I just pause a second? And just, is everyone following this? People understand what the you know, what's happening here with the how much of the area is occupied as how much color a device can capture, right? And the deeper you go into
display.
Yeah, or display, yeah. And the deeper you go into it, the more saturated the color can be. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. So basically, you know, so the answer about gels, which comes up a bit later on, but if you have a really deep saturated gel way out here and you use that on set, and it looks fantastic, in reality, your monitor is only going to display it up to the edge of Rec 709, because Rec 709 is the limit of the grade that you're going into, or the monitor you're on. I mean, most monitors are Rec 709. It's the limit of color they're going to display. So anything outside of Rec 709 is not displayable to the viewer. It's all wasted energy.
So that would explain why, you know, when you get a camera on and you've got some really lovely saturated set, can't get the colors to saturate as you see it to eye.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
And could you in theory then have the light set to Rec 709 so you could see exactly the color that you're going to get?
Yeah, so that's something, you know, we've started doing on the latest software on the Keenaflow, put the gamuts in so you can actually limit the amount of color the fixture can display, so that you know what you're deciding to use as a color is staying within the bounds of what's reproducible.
Right. Very interesting. Yeah.
Okay.
Any questions?
Yep. So we've got, what are some of the best practices for monitoring on set? I've heard having your monitors in an environment that is 6500 Kelvin helps.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for me, it's not really my specialty. That there's a lot of people who even you, Jake, may have a better opinion on it because you provide monitors. You know, what I do know is that we do get involved providing reference lights for grading suites, and really they're very concerned about having a good daylight source generally in order to balance the eye to.
Yeah, I'm asking Joe. I remember he's done some bits with a color grading house, and they have like a very specific setup. So I'm just getting
Yeah.
some details of him.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, it's quite an important factor if you're trying to judge it on set, and also the quality of the monitor, right, is massively important.
Ian, what do you do?
Well, yeah. Yeah, that's a good question, because basically just getting two monitors to actually match is a real battle. And what often happens is I try to limit my variables as much as possible with everything on the film set, pretty much. So what I tend to do is I always shoot Rec 9. I haven't really got into lots of different LUTs, and the reason for that is that I think Dave will come onto this later. I'm way more interested in lighting in the colors, instead of using the lights to control the color palette rather than to affect it in the LUT. So what I tend to do is have a white reference, so have one light set to a color temperature that I dial the camera to, so say 4000 Kelvin, what I tend to do. So I'll have one of the lights dialed into 4000 kelvins and the camera at 4000, so that becomes my white reference. And then I'll kind of light around that, so you know I'll start and this, we'll get onto this, I'll start kind of dialing in certain RGB formulas that I'm interested in by virtue of having a swatch that I've worked with, maybe with the art director beforehand, the set designer and the director, and discussing what kind of colors they're interested in, and looked at, you know, how the set, you know, what colors that the set designer's got in mind, and wardrobe, that sort of thing, and then have a kind of idea of the colors that I might be interested in. And what I really love about this system that we're going to talk about a bit more deeply in terms of the practicalities of it, is that you can, what was frustrating about previously working with gels is that, and I'll get back to the monitor question, so I've gone off a little bit of a tangent here, but I will finish this thought because I think it's important, is with gels, you were kind of usually using one saturation, you know, unless you did with certain popular gels, they have quarters, halves and eighths or whatever, but most say theatrical gel colors, they have one saturation of them, so they're usually too theatrical and too saturated to use. Back in the film days, certainly I'd frightened of them, so I steered away from that, having that kind of color control, playing with color more. But now what I really enjoy is being able to have, like I say, have my white reference, have the monitor set to Rec 709, so I've got some kind of reference. um, and the problem, going back to the monitors, is that the other monitor, but as long as I have one monitor set to Rec 709 that's relatively well calibrated, then that becomes my reference. And then what I do is I have that one white reference, and then put the colors that I'm interested in playing into the, build it from there, and just make sure I always refer back to my one monitor at Rec 709. And then when I go later into the grade, that I say to the grader, this is kind of, you know, I get the grader to pull it back to that neutral point, that white reference point, and then to see where it sits before people get into kind of becoming too artistic in a grade with forcing looks into it, you know. So I like to try and think of it now as that this is a real opportunity for cinematographers to kind of pull back and gain back a little bit of control that we've sort of lost the moment that digital monitor came along, and to the DOP, what is that exactly what we're seeing? Is that exactly what we got? And the moment we had to say, well, yeah, that's it. The client, the agency, everyone got involved on how things should look, and that's when we kind of handed control over, and it, a racehorse designed by a committee is a kind of thing, you know. It became, you know, we lost that power, and then what happens is the graders run with it, and they do the thing, be completely in another direction to what you had planned with what you were shooting, right? So I really like the idea of having this standardized color through the whole process, and then when you get to the grade later, you can basically tell your graders, get it back to neutral, see where all the colors sit, and then make your decisions from there. But yeah, with regard to the monitor, one monitor set to Rec 709, usually as much black around it as possible. So I usually get the gaffer, the Sparks, to put a little black tint around it if they can, or at least a black floppy behind me when I'm looking at the screen. I try and get as good a viewing situation as possible, and that's my reference. You know, the director's monitor, the agency monitor, and so I have to kind of bring problem with some discussion from some negative kind of comments from the agency or whatever. I always bring them over to my monitor. Do you see it on this monitor? And usually that's enough for them to go, no, actually it looks fine on yours. So I say, well, that's our reference. So yeah, is everyone gone? Oh no, oh god, I've lost everyone. So yes, Dave.
Yeah, that was good. Yeah, it was interesting. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Right, shall we move on?
Yeah, there's a few more, but we can.
Okay. Do you want to do them, or?
It's up to you. I mean, there's a good few, so it depends if you want to get through.
Shall I do a few and then we'll stop again, just to keep, because we've still got ways to go. Color gamut and aces. This is just for your information, very quickly. Aces, if you don't know, encompasses the whole of the CIE chart, so it's all the visible spectrum, and it essentially is a source master for basically archiving films in, so that as monitors and display devices get better and can produce more color to represent the human eye's vision more closely, you can remaster images back. You haven't lost any data. You've stored it in
so
AC.
Is that everything the human eye can see then, pretty much?
Yeah. Well, you can see that triangle clips all the edges.
Yeah. So okay.
So, and there is a CTL that each camera manufacturer has to turn it back into its color format. Okay, so the only problem with this would be, from a moral point of view, is that you've shot Blade Runner and you've edited it in Rec 709, for example. Although it was a piece of film, wasn't it? So, but you did it in Rec 709, and then someone comes along and says, "Oh, look, we've got it in Aces. Now let's remaster it for a new release." And they go, "Look, all these great colors we've got," and they redesign the whole look of the film based on, the fact that they've got this new technology, and it's not what the cinematographer had in mind originally.
So it's like a subtle version of having a black and white image and getting it colorized later on.
Yeah. Is it what was intended?
Yeah.
Anyway, it's Aces, and that's out there again from Manpass. So Kinoflow has a gamut, and their fixture, which is basically the space that is created by not by their white engine, because their fixture is divided into two engines, a white engine and a color. The gamut is basically the limits of the RGB, the color engine, and it's what's used to create color gels or effects. So it's outside Rec 709, P3. You can see where it sits. It's a little bit of green here that maybe, as LEDs improve, that they'll source a little bit out there. But basically, well within Rec 709, and pretty much anything you want to do in Rec 2020 as well. And this is really only for getting very saturated colors around the edges. If so let me just see. Primary colors, I think I've said that. The process of blending primary color points such as RGB is referred to. So this is additive, producing color in an additive way, which actually is more efficient than gel because you're not wasting any energy, whereas with gel, you're doing subtractive color. But it is defined by your color points. So, so there are fixtures designed to produce a lot more theatrical gel on purpose. ETC would be a company, for example, that's done a great job of designing fixtures that produce more colors more in sync with, say, a color swatch book more accurately, but their aim for is the theatre stage. And it's a totally different product. What we're concerned about is skin tones and whites, essentially. So, so these are, sorry, this is just showing different RGBs. Sorry, a bit lost there a second. So this is showing two different lights and why they will gel colors. So if you take manufacturer A and manufacturer B, and in this case, their greens are slightly off. When you dial in the green, trying to reproduce a particular color in a digital way, you're going to find that that green offset will produce a different gel color. So the thing you shouldn't mix up is the RGB element, which Ian hopefully could talk a bit more about how he uses that, as opposed to the white engine or the white element of a fixture, which sits in here. So full spectrum white light ensures the best skin tone reproduction. So what, for example, most fixtures are doing, or good quality fixtures are doing, good quality base whites right along the Planckian curve. And that's what creates good skin tones and faithful color reproduction when you're photographing costumes, clothes, sets, whatever. And it's that's going to actually give you good quality, consistent color reproduction on a set. So let me see.
So can I just chip in and say that if we are going to kind of make an allegory to painter, that will be your canvas and how clean your canvas is before you put your pigment on top. Do you know what I mean? So having a solid white background is really important.
Yeah. So if you're doing subtle colors, for example, something like anything like a bar, you're trying to replicate a bit of bounce light, a color hue from some sunlight bouncing off a wall. You basically underneath that, because you're going to start mixing your RGBs with it, you want that white to be really good quality because you want that representation of full spectrum white underlying that very light gel. When you start getting more saturated, as you get more saturated and you go out to the outer edges, the white is being turned down to the point where it gets turned off. When you're using pure RGB, then the white is no longer really in play. So on a very deep color, the white's not really there and not being used. But when you're using just white, okay, and you want to shoot a color out here, as long as your camera can capture it, you're using a white and you're bouncing it off a funny fabric, a funny color set or whatever. Because you have good quality white, you're still going to reflect that light, that color back into the camera, because that's got nothing to do with the RGB. Does that make sense?
No, could you explain that again to me, Dave? Sorry, I'm not fully following that. Say that again.
Okay, so let me just see if color points. Okay, so we have a white engine that's producing white along, and that's separate, yeah?
Yeah.
So if we use that white, so we have it dialed to 3000, and the camera's set to that, and we're shooting a green object that's out here, yeah?
Yeah, yeah.
So a bit of fabric that sits out here somewhere in the nether.
Yeah.
Because we have good quality white, it's going to bounce off that green and it's still going to produce the green out here. That's got nothing to do with the fixture gamut, which is about producing colored light.
Right. So what you're saying is the white light will be producing the full kind of spectrum of that whatever material is back at you.
Yes, it will.
Yeah.
So the better quality your white is, so your white engine, the more accurately you're going to faithfully reproduce real world colors.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm just seeing that I haven't missed anything. So kind of.
We might want to stop for questions in a moment as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, I think I've covered this, but basically, okay, so we'll go into this a little bit more. But if you put a gel, if you want to produce a specific color, and we got an example of this coming up, and you won't be able to do it necessarily with RGB color mixing on the fixture. If you put your light into a Kelvin mode and put a theatrical gel on it, so a Lee gel, you'll produce that color because there's full spectrum white behind the gel, and it will just transmit whatever that gel is allowing to pass through. So you'll get that gel color. And if you want a specific color, that's the way to do it with a theatrical gel. Okay. If you're designing color, like Ian was talking about, then you can do it with RGB because you're making. And to be honest, with RGB, you can see the range of colors available on this fixture gamut here. You've got, in fact, you've got over 2 million colors within this circle here, within Rex. So, yeah.
Can I just pause a second? How long have we been going for now, Jake?
So I believe it's around an hour and a half-ish.
Okay. And Dave, how much longer have you got of the lecture?
Well, I've got a bit more to go, yeah, because we keep stopping.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But we're still good, are we, Jake, for time?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Still
good.
go as long as you guys want. I mean, there's still a good amount of people watching, so.
Okay, good.
It's up to you. If you want to, we can just breeze through the whole presentation and then bank up the questions. Just in case you end up
maybe we should do that.
Yeah. Okay.
Just in case you end up answering people's questions.
Yeah.
Within the
That's right. That's right. Naturally. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And then basically, I'll come back to the Q&A.
I'll try and be concise, and we'll get through this because.
No worries.
Well, okay. So, theatrical gel on full spectrum. So this is an example of what I'm talking about. So this was a test done at a film school in America that Frida actually picked up and ended up doing a bit of testing to figure out the problem. So they were trying to shoot using Storaro straw, whatever it is, Lee 101. So they took a tungsten light that read 2900 and they dialed the camera to 2900. And they put the Lee gel on it and they got what you'd expect to see, Lee 101 yellow on a tungsten light. They then took a LED fixture and they put the fixture to 2900, so that's a white value. And they put a gel on it and they got something that you'd expect to see. Yeah, they recorded that. Then they took that LED fixture and they put in the Lee 101 value at 2900 on that fixture, and that's what they got. Yeah. So it looked yellow to the eye, and everybody thought, oh, it must be a problem somewhere, desk, whatever. It's not coming out right. And so what it transpired to be is the camera set to 2900 couldn't resolve that yellow when it was produced by an LED fixture as opposed to gel. So when they redialed the camera to 6500, so they took it back to its native daylight, could then resolve. Yeah. And so the lesson here is that when you set a camera to tungsten, you're actually using the algorithms that the manufacturer has provided to go from native daylight into tungsten. It causes all kinds of confusion with saturated color.
Is that true, Dave, of all cameras, or is it just?
Yes, because this, well, I think this was, they actually tried this test on a few verifiers. Yeah. Yeah.
So would
And I'm
you
not
say?
saying that the results would all be the same and every single color would react the same way, but in this case, it was, it was the case of a number of different cameras, same thing.
It leads us back to that question earlier about what's the best Kelvin to balance your camera to get more faithful colours. And it seems, looking at this, it seems there's an argument for shooting your camera balance more towards daylight and having colours daylight balanced.
Yeah.
Even when you're in the studio.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to do deep saturated colors in these are. But again, it's about knowing your equipment.
Yeah.
Because if you're using very subtle colors, and like you said, at 4,000 Kelvin, you might find it works fine.
Mm.
So that's quite a heavy color, that Lee 101. It's outside of Rec 709, for example.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So pointers gamut, color gamut, just as a quick one. So this is pointers gamut. These are real world. Take a surface, and so you take a matte surface and record it. This is the gamut that this is as large amount of color you'll be able to reproduce from the real world. So this is a matte surface, not a reflective one. So costumes, clothes, and everything. This is basically the limits of what they'll.
So it's a matte surface, a material that's matte in its reflective properties.
Yeah. So there's a difference in a reflective surface like a car and a matte surface like a piece of material. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is referring to a matte surface. Okay. So a car would have two values. It would have a reflective value and a matte in terms of its color response or its color values.
And what would a reflective one look like? Do you have that as well or not?
No, I don't. This is Pointer's color gamut is a test that's done by a scientist to actually say this is what you can record, off a real world environment. So worrying about stuff out here, depending on, I mean, I'm not saying that you wouldn't ever shoot at, but it's difficult. And naturally, in most of the stuff you're doing, you'll be limited to this.
So like you said earlier, outside there's more like light effects. Yeah. And highly reflective materials.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Interesting.
Okay. So Rec 2020 encompasses.
And that's called Pointer's gamut. That matte thing.
Yeah, you can look it up. You can read into it.
Okay.
Anyone who's interested.
People are reporting some audio issues. David, can you try something? If you go into Discord.
Yeah. Hold on one sec. Yeah.
And then if you click the little cog in the bottom right, that one there, yeah. And then go to voice and video on the left. There. Up, that one there, yeah. And then where it says automatically determine input sensitivity. So if you, on the right hand side, if you click the little button, and then if you drag that slider all the way down, just all the way down, there we go. And then hit escape. This should help.
And then slideshow. Okay.
Ian, if you do the same thing as well, mate.
Okay. So let me remember that. So settings, voice and video, input. What was it? What volume? What one? Automatic
voice and video on the left hand side.
Is that better, by the way, Jake?
Yeah.
Did you say automatically determine input sensitivity?
Yep. And then on the right, toggle that off, and then slide the slider all the way down.
On the right. Down. No, Input
Yeah.
volume, output volume. Sorry, I missed that last bit.
So where the user settings, voice and video,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
then
I'm
where
in
it
that
says
now.
automatically determine input sensitivity,
Yeah, I'm in. Oh, I see toggle there. Right.
toggle
Yeah.
that, and then
Yeah.
slide it all the way down.
Yeah. Got it. Done.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay.
Perfect.
Thanks. Okay.
Okay, so I'm just going to go through different white light systems so you know what you're getting when you're on a set. Okay, so we started out originally with bicolor, so that's phosphor-based white, daylight and tungsten, one of each. And obviously the limitation of that is we're not tracking the Planckian curve because we haven't got enough color information in order to add into it. A lot of fixtures are RGBW, and they basically have a warm tone white generally, and they then create their Kelvins by using RGB. So that, again, has some deficiencies in its white because you're using quite narrow band peaks to create your Kelvin. What we're currently doing with the KinoFlow system is we're using two white. So we have a white engine that's daylight and tungsten, and the RGB, we then modulate the magenta green for tracking the Planckian curve and for creating gel colors. Okay, there are many other systems out there, things like this. So red, rose red, green, lime green, blue, white, and amber. These are great, but they're very complicated to manage when you're trying to work to camera. But they're very good at making theatrical gels, not so good at making white. They compromise on the whites, which we'll look at right now. So not all white light is the same. So this is RGB WW, so warm white and cool white. So this is the KinoFlow chip here in the green, recorded on KinoFlow system. And this is an RGB with a single white. And you see this, we'll see it on some camera responses, but this dip here causes quite a few problems. And this lack of energy here is all energy that you're not using to expose the colors that you're photographing. So that will come out in the quality of color reproduction. Okay, and we can map that through here. So the XY coordinates match. So, they both sit on the Planckian curve. We've got here fairly good readings on all of them. We've got three cameras, the Amira, two cameras. We've got the Amira on the blue spectrum, on the KinoFlow spectrum. We've got the Amira on the red spectrum, on the single white spectrum. And we have the red Mysterium on the single red as well. And you can see here the difference in responses these cameras have. So anything below 0.12 is not correctable. So we're saying that 0.07 is fine. You're not really going to correct that. 0.16, you're going to put about an 8th correction in to get it back onto the Planckian curve down here. And 0.21, to make that neutral white, you'll have to add getting on for a quarter magenta in order to get the green out. And so you can see there's a big variance as we go. So that is with a CC2 of 3200 roughly. Okay. So they're all reading roughly the same color temperature. Okay. So if we take that both those fixtures and we dial them to daylight and we do the same thing, we have a daylight reading now. So we have slightly enhanced blue spectrum, and okay, the XY coordinates are slightly offset, but in daylight, we probably wouldn't notice the difference there because, once you get into the high Kelvin, a few hundred Kelvins doesn't really matter. When we get onto here, we can see that we're above 90, so they're all acceptable in a color reference in the PRI, photographic rendering index. And we can see here on the gels, the first one, the Amira, is you don't really need to correct it. Oops. On the blue one, you want to put an 1/8 on it, or you want to dial in some green. And then you can see that the red actually deals with this better in daylight than it did in tungsten, which kind of makes sense based on what we've been talking about. So when we get into something, so we're still using our green line as a reference source. So that's the Keenaflow 2700 chip running at 3.2, dialed at 3.2. And then we do it against a multi-colored chip. So it's got multiple colored chips to make gel colors. You can see how much missing energy there is. And we'll quickly run through this. The coordinates are slightly offset on the Planckian curve. And you can see that, again, we're in the same camera setup. We've got relatively okay PRIs at the bottom. Up top, we're still within range on the green reference on the first camera. On the second, we need to put a whole bunch of correction. But on the red, on this light, we're okay. We don't need to correct the red because it just, in the chaos of it, it's worked out. If we look at the same lights, again, dialed to daylight, run through this quick. We're matching on the XY. And again, once we get up to PRIs, we're looking a little bit better on the PRI at the bottom. We get up top, you can see how far the green magenta has just gone completely off piste. So 36 for the Amira on that red source, and 33. So you need getting on for a half correction. And take the same light, dial it to daylight. And again, little offset on the Planckian curve. And see our PRIs are looking pretty good. And then we go up to our green magentas, and they're completely different. So we're up to 36 on the, sorry, I've gone ahead of myself here. Sorry, talking too fast. These are all three spectrums together. So these are all the three lights that we're using as examples. And basically the point of this was to show the chaos that you encounter on a set when you start using multiple different sources. You're going to have different hues and colors coming into play unless you know what you're doing and you can correct them. So sorry, I lost there. Right. So hope everybody got that and understood it. I'll move on to matching white light. So how can we harmonize all these fixtures together? And we touched on this briefly. You can't, but you can get close. And one of the ways of doing that is with XY color settings. So on the new Sekonic C7000 and on the one I have, the 800, you've got the XY. So basically XY gives you, on the CIE, it gives you empirical points to measure. So you can go up to a light and get an XY reading, and then you can dial it into, well, on a Keenaflow, you have an XY setting on the menu. You can dial that XY reading into the Keenaflow to match the other light. So we can show it here a little bit better. So, okay, so basically, I think okay, just to make it easy. So we've got X and Y running here, and they give us a point. Instead of using gamuts and other forms of measurement, XY gives us 2 points at which we can plot a color coordinate on the CIE chart. And that's how XY works. So color matching colored gels, a color space such as Rec 709 P3 in 2020 define the chromaticity of the red, green, and blue color points, as well as a defined white. So when this refers to when you're using a fixture, when you want to match a gel, you have to define your white point to where you match it from. So a lot of people use swatch. This is Show Tool swatch, for example, and it gives you 2.55 values in the red, green, and blue, so you can match a gel. So dark salmon has these values: 255, 117.
So you can dial those straight into the lights, can you not? Dave?
Can dial that straight into the light to produce that gel. And the fixed point you're dialing from is defined by the white point that the light is set to. So here
So
we're
then you
starting
can-
with daylight.
So then you can move your tungsten daylight, holding those values, the RGB values, and moving them through the
Yeah.
planking curve.
So on a Keener flow, for example, you could dial this in daylight, and it will give you this coordinate. Then you can actually go back to your Kelvin setting, and the light will behave as though you changed the light source, the Kelvin behind the gel. So it's like you've
Yeah.
just put a different light, and you can stop anywhere in the Kelvin range when you do this.
So can I just butt in real quick and say this? So this is what we've started doing on set now. Is, like I said earlier, we start playing with gels that normally would be too saturated to play with, like in a confident way. And as you well know, these days you don't really have time to do these little experiments on set with a full crew and, you know, and a client there. So I've, you know, started working with the lighting team I work with, and we can dial these in very quickly into the lights, and then we get into being able to desaturate the light. Or desaturate or saturate the hue that you're working with, and then, as Dave mentioned, you can play around with moving it along that planking curve into more daylight or tungsten range, the daylight or tungsten range, and it gives you a really quick control of the hue that you're interested in playing with, and then you can sit it into the set in a way that we could never before have done with gel.
Yeah, so it's giving you gels that you can then modify. So in other words, you're not limited to the swatch book in your pocket anymore. You can actually go in and be very subtle in the changes you make.
Yeah,
And you can design
which
your
is,
own colors.
so the big kind of sort of light bulb going off in my head was suddenly I could start using these gels in a very subtle way, or as confident as a art set designer and director wanted me to go with it. Is, you know, so it was a very kind of a thing that I could modulate really quickly, and that gave me the confidence to start moving, playing them a lot more. So, you know, I was afraid of color before when I, you know, was working with gels, and now I'm starting to build more confidence in playing with color more, through the fact that I can kind of have such quick control over it, and I can back it off really quickly if it doesn't look right, or reset it back to the original natural. And that's what I tend to do as well. I play with the color, and just as a quick reference to see where we are with it, because sometimes you can lose your eye in this process. If you just say to the spark, can you just flick that back to tungsten for me so I can see what that's doing, and then they can just flick it to tungsten and flick it back to the color, and you can see very quickly if it's going to work or not.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, so I think we've covered this. This last point here is just how you automatically be mapped back to the Rec 709 if you go beyond it. So the monitor will limit, or the post-production process will limit what colors you're actually going to show. Okay. There's a Lee app actually that's free that does all of this in XY, which looks really interesting because it gives you, I think the Swatch Show Tools one gives you only in daylight, the figures in daylight. This gives you a tungsten, and they call it Source C. It gives you a daylight, and you can dial it in with just X and Y as well. So it's even quicker. So that's interesting. I haven't really used that much, but I'm definitely going to give that a shot. It gives you a good reference point to start from, and that's basically what the XY dial looks like on the Keenflow. It's really simple, and it gives you XY, which if you take a reading instead of using it for gel, gives you that match for lining up to another source as well. So it just gives you some numbers to play with.
And maybe when you finish the technical lecture, we can talk a little bit about how we can utilize XY on film sets, and you know, create a kind of level of correct control with color
For me,
through
that's
using.
the revolution. That's where the revolution is. That's where color revolution lies. And if you can learn to use that, you're doing something that could never be done before.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Yeah. So we can talk about that also. Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of standards, matching RGBs, ESTA. I think someone asked about this earlier on. ESTA, which was the Entertainment Services and Technology Association, but they're more in line with live events. Created a gamut, and they created their own gamut, but they gave it a tungsten reference point, and they're the only people in the world who've done that. We put it in as a gamut in the lighting fixture, so you can set the light to run in ester. Everything goes a very different color. You kind of have to play with this stuff and have a look at the light and understand how it operates in reference to this information. But it's relatively simple, but you can basically click it into these settings now. But this kind of referencing, matching RGBs has been changed with XY, because if we go XY instead of using gamuts, it doesn't matter what the gamut of the RGBs are. XY just gives you a place on the CIE chart that you're going to hit regardless. So that's the way we want to go in order to match gel colors. So X and Y is empirical. So a much more sensible place for us to go. So if you look on a Keener Flow menu now, we have Rec 709, P3, Rec 2020, and Ester. So basically, if you're trying to be realistic and true to the final edit, you can set it to Rec 709, and you're going to be limited to that triangle, which is the triangle of your monitor, of your display device. XY, it's a great way to measure reflected light, which I think is what you're referring to, Ian, in a location, and then match the quality of light with the fixture. Something we'll talk about a little bit more in a bit.
Yeah.
General Kelvin may be easier to match. Saturated colors may be matched as long as the gamuts are similar. So the point is that if you've got two different instruments from different people, they have different outputs. It's a little bit like walking into a paint store and buying two different whites from two different manufacturers. When you get home and paint them on the wall, they're going to look different because they're from different factories. That's kind of the truth about LEDs. You can't expect to walk into a rental house and choose 15 different LEDs from different manufacturers and any of them to match. They're all going to be slightly different. A couple of them might be very similar, but they're all, when you start playing with the controls, they're going to operate differently. They're going to dim. Their color shifts are different. There's a fallacy that LEDs don't change color when they dim. The good ones really hold it down to a certain point, but at the end of the day, as you get very low, they're all going to have some, just by the definition of the technology, they're going to have some color shifting going on. You can't have all of this color magic, this facility, without having some understanding some of the limitations of it. And when you're talking about an array of LEDs working at very low light levels, at some point when you dim down, some of those RGBs are going to switch off because they've gone beyond their value. They've gone below their value. They can no longer emit at a percentage level that's relatable to the place it should be when they're at 50%, if that makes sense.
Do you think there's an argument, Dave, for having like a frame where you can put NDs into, say, your soft lights?
Yeah, I think there's a place for having bobbynet if you're really serious about it. And NDs I'm never too keen on because I find green kind of creeps into them. But bobbynet and things like that, because they're so cool anyway. I mean, it's just a nicer way to do it. It's a bit sort of, I suppose, old school, but it's like scrims on old lights. It still works. Good way to knock it back. The other thing is to choose the right instrument for what you're doing. If you go and get a 400 watt LED light and you go, right, I'm going to use it for a subtle bit of fill here because it's the light I've got, and you dim it down to 5%, the color's going to go to hell. And you've chosen the wrong instrument for that. You're asking too much of the light.
And that's even true when you just stay at 5.6 or 3.2 or something. That's still true of.
Well, there are pure points on. It depends on the LED, and it depends whether it has pure points. If you understand the pure points of an LED light, you can dim it almost to zero without a color shift. But you need to understand that. I
So
mean,
you
if
need to know
people
what your
really
pure
want to go
points-
into this stuff, I suggest come and see us when we're back up and running, and I'll run through it in real time with an instrument, and I'll show you how that works. Yeah.
But do you know the pure points of the lights that for Kino, for example?
Yeah,
Do you know where the pure points-
so 2.7 and 6.5.
Right. Okay. Good to know.
Yeah. So, I mean, basically, it's the source white that you want to hit to be it in order to dim down. Yeah. So new developments. So this is, I think we touched on this a little bit. The camera LUTs are now on the menu on the KinoFlow lights, and this is where we've gone in and we've taken all of those mappings of the cameras and those green and magenta values, and we've mapped them in, and we've created a camera curve and each camera has a different shape curve as it goes around the planking curve. Some of them start high, finish low, or vice versa, or some of them clip unevenly over the top, or graze underneath. Canon, Sony, they all have different looks. So we accommodate that in a camera LUT. And what a camera LUT does, it's giving you neutral white and a curve that is neutral all the way from daylight to tungsten, so that you're not putting any color artifacts onto your image until you decide to do it. So it's going to give you true white. And then if you want to add some green or magenta or color or whatever, you do that, but you have a neutral white starting point. And a camera LUT will give it for a particular camera.
So it's going back to the film stock idea.
Yes. So we haven't measured enough cameras because it takes a long time to measure cameras. But the idea is we're going to start throwing more cameras into the menu that you can update the software and have as we go forward. So
Yeah,
it's coming.
So every camera is a different film stock, and 6.5 is the new 5.6. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
6.5 is the new 5.6. Yes. And that comes from Kodak 5.6, and of course everybody called daylight 5.6, but mathematically it's 6.5, and all the new LEDs and cameras have gone that route. So another new development is the XY matching mode on the KinoFlow. That's interesting. RGB color gamut selection is new. We've been through that. These are all very new developments that have just come out in the last year that really begin to take the technology to a new place. So we finally made it to summary. So just very quickly in summary, color indexes, TM30, TLCI, SSI provide some information, but not enough actionable data. So use your color meter for what it's good for, but don't expect miracles out of it. All white Kelvin is not created equal. Understand the differences and how it may affect your color rendering. Differentiate between additive color mixing and subtractive color rendering. Gels on full spectrum white LEDs, subtractive color, may render saturated colors better than the limited gamut range of a fixture. XY matching is very useful in replicating bounce light and other natural location light. XY for color picking will be limited by the gamut of the fixture. Color points outside the gamut will be rendered at a lower saturation level. So XY will be limited by what any particular fixture can produce and whether it has an XY facility on it in the first place. So think of shooting in zones. This is something, so we did a film, I'll talk about it a bit at the end if anyone's interested. We did a film with Schwartzman, John Schwartzman from LA in the UK last winter. It's the first film we did with the camera LUTs where he was using the Panavision DXL. He used all KinoFlows on the interior of the set and he used whatever outside the set walls. So he created two zones and they actually went with the DI. As the DI became pretty much the theatrical release. And he stood up at Cinegear in LA and said it was a game changer for him in post, because what he shot is what went out.
This I should just interject here and say this is exactly what I've been experiencing. Is you know, oftentimes I go into the grade and the graders try to, you know, quite naturally put his or her own kind of slant on things, and I've asked them to go back to what was shot, to make it neutral again, and suddenly it comes to life, you know, and they've just had to do just subtle shifts in remedial work and just bringing contrast from different scenes together and stuff without going too far into affecting the colors.
And that is really the idea, and it's what we would have done on film. So it's getting back to that discipline of what you're shooting in front of the camera is what you're getting out the back.
Yeah, and gives the control back to the cinematographer as well. So
pick appropriate size fixtures to ensure color stability at lower dim settings. Does the fixture track the Planckian curve? It's a question. Camera profiles best applied when working in white light profiles have little effect on gel colors. So yeah, so camera profiles are only when you're working in white, and gamuts really only work when you're doing gel colors. They're only important when you do gel colors. So Rec 709 is only important when you want to know the limits of a gel color.
That's really good to know. That's a really good point, Dave. Yeah, that's a really clear it in my mind. Yeah.
And camera profiles are really good when you're matching, trying to work in neutral, with a neutral white base, with a curve that conforms to the camera that you're working with.
Yeah.
Okay. So the conclusion is, just as Rembrandt and Vermeer chose their pigments carefully, today's cinematographers must choose their spectral palettes carefully. Of course, many people don't, but that's, you know, what we're trying to provide is high quality pigments and high quality control. If you analyze a Vermeer painting today, you don't even have to know he painted it. You could actually analyze the white and you know he painted it because it came from his studio. And that's how much care they took over their pigments. A good broad spectrum white light goes a long way to solving a lot of these issues, and that really underpins everything that Keenaflow are designing into their fixtures at the moment. Think of your LED lighting fixture as a white light generator and the range of colors it can reflect back to camera, as well as a color generator and what gamut range of colors it can project. So basically, it's two things. It does white and it does color. When mixing different forms of white light, take the time to test how they will harmonize. Test your choice of camera to your lights. A fixture's color science is the 21st century pigment. The fixtures are the brushes. So you choose your brush, fat, thin, fine, and your pigment is the color coming out of it. Choose your pigment wisely or suffer the consequences when color grading. And that, we've done it. We got there. Thank you. Thanks everyone for listening.
Well done, Dave. That's brilliant. Really, really helpful. One thing I'd just like to throw on the end of that is the extent to which you have color fidelity in your lights will be, I think, will become significant as a choice of what camera or lenses you use.
Yeah, I mean, I think the people who have taken the care, because it's all quite new, this, so the people who've taken care to go into it have begun to explore it and realize what it can do for them as artists or, you know, as creators. The other issue is that we're a little bit in the Wild West because all this technology is new. So as many benefits all this technology has that, you know, that come outside gamut and color and all the refinements. You know, there's efficiencies, power savings, batteries, all these other things. So I think the point is, you know, at what point do you decide to use an instrument and for what reason?
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much for coming along, Dave. This has been such an education. I mean, I've heard some of this stuff before, but to hear it all together like that is hugely informative and it's really helped me have a clearer understanding of
Well,
the importance of
thanks
this.
for asking.
So we have a load of questions, do we not?
Yep. Yeah, it's a good few. So the first one I can see is from Sitting in 6 again. So RE white light, if you have two lights tracking correctly to the Planckian curve, can they still appear different because they have different spectrums?
If they have different spectrums, they will appear different. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Kagatota, PRI is a new metering standard that KinoFlow is suggesting, or is it already existent?
No,
Sorry, it's my ignorance.
PRI is their in-house averaging, if you like, their in-house index that they created because there wasn't anything they were happy with using.
Okay, cool. Chris Hallam says, do all of KinoFlow's LED lights stick to the Planckian curve?
All our new, everything that's full color does. So everything we built in the last 4, maybe even 5 years now does. As long as it has an RGB facility or a gel generation facility, it will stick to the Planckian curve, and its software is all upgradable and everything.
Cool. If X, sitting in the 6 again, if XY is looking at the overall CIE chart, does it then take CCT and green magenta into account to be able to watch white between two fixtures?
What it's doing is, so XY is just looking at a fixed point on that chart, and literally an XY coordinate, and then you dial that coordinate into the light on the XY menu on the light to replicate as closely as possible to the fixture you measured in the first place. And then again, you know, like the first question, it's how close are the spectrums how close those spectrums are will determine how close those lights will get, but that will get you as close as you can get.
So,
and as you know, yeah, there's compromises to be made,
yeah,
especially when you're in, you know, on location.
From Sydney 6 again, in the case of the Kino, if you put the lamp into Rec 709, but your XY is outside of that gamut, how does the lamp react?
Right, when you're working in a gamut, you're working with RGBs to their limits. When you're working in XY, you're not actually working with the gamut anymore. You've gone beyond that. So XY is a different way of running the light, if you like. It's like a different operating system.
Cool. What else we got? Coco says, would you allow other manufacturers to use your data, not for free, of course, so they can also allow adjusting their lights to certain cameras?
That is a question for KinoFlow, and I know he's part of the Academy's Science and Technology Committee, and along with a lot of other manufacturers. So I guess that's something that he would discuss with them. You know, it's not something I would be able to comment on.
Lots of thank yous and cheers. How far are we from LED options for high-powered lights?
Well, it depends what we call high-powered, of course, but there are some pretty good efforts coming out. I saw, I think it was a 4K equivalent, 4K HMI equivalent, so pretty bright, from Cineo at the BSC show. I saw a prototype actually at IBC, and that, I mean, it's a crude optic, but it's pretty bloody bright, and that's bicolor with an oil-cooled system around the LEDs to keep them cool. I've got there's a company called Felix who've asked me to get involved with them. They actually have their own factory in San Francisco. They make their own chips. Their dense arrays are, I mean, I think they're at least 5 years ahead of the market. Their fixture designs, some of the smaller ones are really good, but their big ones, I've got a 900 watt, which we hope to push to about 1200 watts soon. That is pretty impressive. So that's 1200 watt, potentially par Fresnel type fixtures will come out of that technology.
Awesome. James Rudd.
Can I just add a little comment to that? Dave, do you think it's going to be harder for the LED manufacturers to create a hard, powerful LED source than a soft LED source to make it specular? Is that going to be a challenge?
I think the problem with a dense array, so a point source, is how do you get all that heat? So the problem with heat with LEDs is if you go above, 80 odd degrees, for, without being exact, what happens is the phosphors and the RGBs in there, they start degrading. So they start basically losing color as anything that, gets overexposed to energy does, like fabrics in the sun. So they start fading. So you have to get that heat off. You have to maintain a temperature below that, particular fixed point. Getting all that heat off a 900 watt chip that's possibly less than 10 centimeters round is really difficult, and that's what they're working on.
Right.
Yeah.
So
then if you want hard light, depending on what you call hard light, if you want true hard light, then you really don't want the array getting too big.
Yeah. And is there anything they can do to optically take something that is got a larger array and then by using
Focusing
optics,
it in.
focus it in? Yeah.
I haven't seen anything. I mean, it's a good question, actually. I mean, normally we use, or the industry's used, Fresnels, which refraction. So you basically kind of do that but you don't really get that small when you do it. What a Fresnel is. It's bigger than the source, essentially. Just gathering it. Whether there's a way of doing that, be difficult. A lot of optics to do it.
Yeah.
So James Rudds asks, how do data light LEDs, DD4s and 7s match to the curve? I work with them a lot.
No, they don't. I mean, maybe Ian, because Ian works with these as well. They don't. The problem with that point source is it's difficult to put the magenta green into a point source and maintain the integrity of the point source for his optics. That becomes an optical challenge.
Yeah, so I mean, I work with them a lot, but when it comes to something really faithful, that for color fidelity is absolutely essential. Say, for example, food. I use the bicolor LEDs sometimes as backlights, but I always keep a very close eye on how the color's looking to me. But then I sometimes default down to the tungsten dados, the classics. And I particularly like a dado called a 436, which is a very small 36 volt 400 watt bulb that's very hard source. It's a beautiful, like looking kind of specular kind of sunlight looking source. So yeah, I sometimes do that. I stick to tungsten if I feel like I'm getting into trouble. So yeah, but they're pretty good color science, the dados, and
Yeah, no, the color science he does, he's taken a huge amount of care, TLC over it, but they don't have magenta green in them to accommodate every single camera and really follow that curve very closely. But he's done a good job with them. And using them in tungsten on daylight, the chips we have now are really, really good. I mean, I think, Ian, you use them in pure daylight, pure tungsten quite a lot, don't you? Because you're using them for sunlight, if I'm right.
All the time, yeah. I mean, the DLED7 is probably one of my favorite lights at the moment because it's such a versatile light. So yeah, I mean, I use them an awful lot. I've never got into trouble with them in terms of skin tones or anything like that. I thought that's fine. With food, I'm sometimes a little bit more cautious. But as a backlight, I use them on food. So yeah, I pretty much use them for everything.
Yeah.
Awesome. So fantastic. Thank you. So to follow up, if the Planckian curve is absolute, unless I'm mistaken, would it not trump what the spectrum is of the light in the case of matching whites on the two different lights?
So say that again, Judge. Quite get that.
To follow up, if the Planckian curve is absolute, unless I'm mistaken, would it not trump what the spectrum is of the light in the case of matching whites on the two different lights?
So the Planckian curve is the natural phenomena of what happens. So what you're trying to do with a light that follows that is replicate that that journey from daylight to tungsten faithfully. So anywhere you stop on that line, you're faithful. When you're trying to match two spectrums, so what we're concerned about is matching to a particular camera. In the case of Kinoflow, because you can switch it into, say, the Venice or whatever. So when you're trying to match two sources, you've created. I mean, the thing is, you have a lot of control on the Kinoflow, so you would go and measure light X, get an XY reading, and then put it into the Kinoflow. The thing that you can only match one source with the Kinoflow. You have to choose what your target is. If it's the other LED X and you've done an XY reading on it, the differences between the Kinoflow and that light are going to be based on the differences of the core LEDs in the lights, what light they can produce, in combination of how the camera reads those LEDs. So the spectral sensitivity curve of that particular camera may be different depending on the camera make. I don't know if I've answered that clearly, or whether I got the question right, but anyway.
Cool. So Chad asked, just trying to make sure I fully understand the info. If you shoot with an array, for an example, and match your lamp to the camera color space, the representation of gels with the RGB becomes more accurate.
The whites is the thing to really be concerned about, and skin tones.
So when you're shooting with a camera LUT, you're talking about white. Once you go into the RGB engine, you're basically breaking that rule. You can't. You're actually turning the white engine off, and you're going into gel colors, which don't reference a camera. They're just gel colors. So you're not working with camera lookup tables when you're working with gels, because then you're just trying to produce a color instead of reproduce white in the natural world, which is a particular thing that the camera LUT's for. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So question for Ian from Chris. Could you please go back to talk about your reference white in the studio? Do you shoot a chart at the top of the day lit at a certain CCT, or do you make sure something in the frame is this CCT?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I want to get more into that. And that's why I was talking to Dave about the possibility of making a little box that has a pure white inside the box that I can put onto any set with any mixture of colors and immediately get a white reference. So we've been talking about that, and I'd love to have that as a way forward to have every scene with a white reference, and then the grader could just match to that very quickly and see exactly what I was trying to do in camera. So at the moment, we do little grayscales and stuff, but I'd much prefer a color box that has the pure white in it. That would be better. So
basically what we can do, which I haven't got yet, and this virus isn't helping us get anything new either, is I'm waiting for some Kinoflow to come out with some ribbon, and we could then make a box and we could run it off a Kinoflow power supply. So you dial your reference point in, have the exact, so if you decide your reference is 4000, for example, you could run it off a Kinoflow ballast, produce that in the light box, take a shot, and that's your neutral white starting point. And then every light references off that starting point.
Yeah.
And that's something we could easily do, but I can't do it until I can get some chips.
But in answer to that question, for me, it's more of a philosophy of knowing somewhere in the frame I have my reference whites, which I can put a grayscale into to communicate that to the grader. But even without the grader, even without the grayscale or the grader knowing where I am, what I'm trying to do, that just for my own philosophy, I always have a white reference in mind. Yeah, so just because otherwise I find I get a little bit lost in color. So if I am going to go down this kind of color rabbit hole, so to speak, I want to have a point of reference that I can pull myself out of it with, you know. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Cocos again, and one more for Ian. I posted earlier. If you know you will be going for a more stylized grade, hue shifts, for example, would you still monitor 709 and why, especially if not shooting on a stage?
Especially if not shooting on the stage, was that?
Yeah.
Well, most things are going to be seen as 709, are they not? So, Dave, monitors, correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, are most monitors 709?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So all displays are 709, are they not?
Yeah. Yeah. And everyone's
So-
house and your grading.
Yeah. Yeah, so therefore it's only ever going to be seen in Rec 709. So going beyond that is at the moment is kind of a moot point, really. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're thinking of future proving your work, so you can go into a different color space later on with it, then that's another thing. But for now, you're only ever going to get it seen in Rec 709. So that's your the limits of your color space.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question?
As you see from Pointer's gamut, that Rec 709 is not that far off real world colors. So it depends what you're shooting, of course, because that only holds true if you're doing real life photography. You know, I mean, you're shooting sets and people and stuff. But if you're doing a more theatrical project, then maybe that's not true.
Yeah, I haven't gotten into the more theatrical. Like I said, I've always shied away from that. So my journey with color starting off in subtle color. What I'm really interested in color is how color, for example, one of my things I've been thinking a lot about is how color creates 3 dimensions. So for example, when I light a face, having a subtle blue into the back light and a subtle warmth into the front light is a kind of obvious thing. But if you're kind of getting into more than one fixture lighting the face, for example, and you start making slight color shifts between the fill, your modeling light, your fill light and your backlights, and you start playing with those 3 points of color. I do that quite a lot now. And then within the set, again, exaggerating that. So for example, sometimes I put the light on the face as a slight cooler color. And then when it comes to the background lights, I make that cooler, another stage cooler. So I'm creating a kind of like, almost like a fake atmosphere, because when you look into nature, if you look at the horizon, you're looking through atmosphere, and that makes things go cooler and bluer by virtue of the vapor in the air. And that's why we perceive things as being bluer is further away. So blue retreats and red advances. So if you start playing with that as a way of making your imagery more 3-dimensional, you know, so you're playing with subtle reds in the foreground and subtle blues in the background, you'll naturally, that color contrast will naturally stretch the image out and make it more 3-dimensional. So stuff like that I'm interested in, like really subtle kind of uses of color, rather than getting into kind of really garish kind of theatrical colors. That there's a time and place for that, obviously, and if the right idea comes along, right script comes along, and that's required, then I'd like to try and play with that. I mean, I did a Stone Island shoot recently, and we had some really vibrant jackets that we were filming, and what we started playing with is putting amplifying those colors by putting the same color into the lights that the jackets were. So we had, for example, we had a pink, a yellow, and a blue, powder blue jacket. And so what I did was I got my show tool swatch and I went around on the sample rail and matched the color up to the jackets. I didn't have to match the saturation, I just had to match the hue, because remember, we can control the saturation, so I could get quite a good hue match on the jackets. And then I put that into the lights, and then what we did was we dialed down the saturation so it didn't look too electronic. And then as a reference, remember I said earlier, the best thing to do is a reference just to switch the light back to daylight to see what you're actually doing. And you could see the difference in the vibrance of the jacket. Suddenly the jacket just had this real vibrance to it. And that really excited me. That's a simple little thing, but I got really excited about it because I was thinking, now we're painting with deeper pigments, and that I found very satisfying. And communicating actually the color of the jacket, because I remember when I saw the guy walking across the soundstage towards me, I went, wow, that's a yellow jacket. I mean, it was so vibrant yellow, it looked amazing. And then when he came under the lights, because it's Rec 709, we lost some of that vibrance. So it wasn't like we're kind of lying about the color. If anything, we're trying to communicate the experience of seeing that color in the real world, right? But because of the limitations of Rec 709, we had to amp it up a bit. So yeah.
So,
But
and then, that's really interesting way of using it. And the other, the other thing that we touched on is the actual flow of light, of bounce light. That's interesting that you couldn't
yes, yeah,
use
okay. So
the
this is another theory I often talk about. Is a thing I refer to as a flow of light. It's the way light moves around a room. And so it's kind of part of this kind of narrative of light idea I have, where, like when the light comes through a window, it's actually picked up lots of stuff through the atmosphere and through trees and bouncing off, puddles or whatever's happening in the sky at the time, whether you're in an urban setting or a natural landscape, whether you're by the sea, whatever. All of that ambience of light coming in that room is picking up all that color information and that quality of light information, and then it's bouncing around the interior of the room. So if you had like brick red, like brick walls or something that was a brick red in color, then that light would naturally pick that up from the bounce, right? So what excites me about the XY metering is that you could actually measure that exactly, and you could get your software. So when you want to accent point, so I'm interested in working to the flow of light that happens through a room in terms of the quality and the intensity of the light, but creating accent points of it and repressing it in other areas. So you're basically, it's like a painter would paint a canvas, and they would accent certain points of that canvas and repress other points of it. They'd still stay true to the flow of light, but they'd be manipulating that flow of light. So it ends up looking naturalistic, but it has a painterly or a three-dimensional or an atmospheric quality to it that you're trying to dial in. So it's kind of like understanding what the rules are you're working to, and then manipulating those rules in a subtle way. And the same can be true of color control. So you're working to the flow of light, not just in the quality of light, but also in the way the light picks up certain colors when it bounces around a room. So, for example, Bradford Young talks a lot about when he was lighting, because he's as you well know, he uses a lot of practical lights, and he likes to underlight things and just sometimes use natural light and just the practical lights in a room without too many film lights. And so what he does is gets his gaffer to build always gets the art department to buy 2 practicals rather than 1. Am I still on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm still on.
Yeah, all good,
2 practicals rather than 1. And what they do is they hack one of the practicals up, and they turn it into a softbox with the same quality of light. And then they use that practical as a way of fill lighting, or producing more light that would be coming from the practical in shot. So it's a way of trying to stay true to that flow of light. But the XY meter is an even more controllable way of doing that, because where Bradford Young's taking the actual, say, the lampshade and turning that coloured light into another light, what you'll be doing with the XY reading is taking the exact reading of what that lampshade does off the wall next to it and reflects back at the subject. You'll be taking that exact reading of that what that colour's doing, and then being able to reproduce that. So you're staying completely within the flow of light when it comes to colour reproduction, and that I find really exciting.
Yeah, I mean that's new. That's beyond gel. That's something we just couldn't do. So I'm really interested to see how people explore that in the next few years.
Yeah.
Awesome. I think it's probably worth it opening up to anyone in Discord who wants to ask a question and have a chat with either David or Ian. Feel free to unmute your mics and just ask away. In terms of stuff that's on the YouTube chat, there's not that many. So Coco followed up on the question that you responded to Ian about the 709 monitoring. I mainly meant, would you still monitor a neutral 709 LUT if, let's say, you wanted a slightly hue shifted grass towards orange, for example, not meaning turn green into orange, but just a slight shift on the slider in that direction?
Sorry, read the beginning bit again. I got to the end bit. You broke up a bit at the beginning.
Sorry. I mainly meant, would you still monitor a neutral 709 LUT if, let's say, you wanted a slightly hue shifted grass towards orange, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I would really be doing that, making that decision more in the grade with the grader. I mean, I know we don't get paid to go to grades, but I try and attend them as much as I can, particularly if I'm interested in the piece I've done and I've got a good relationship with the director. I'm always like bugging them and saying, let me know the grade, let me know when the grade's happening, because I really want to come along, if I'm not shooting, of course. But I like to kind of see the whole project through, and that's when I'd be working with the grader, and I'd have some notes that yeah, for example, that's the time for me to play with that idea of making affecting things that in the natural world needs to be skewed.
Awesome. But yeah, I think that's all the questions from the YouTube chat. Yeah, anybody else got any questions in Discord? Just unmute your mic and just ask away. If not,
You've probably
then
worn them all down, Dave, by now, I would imagine. How long now has it been?
about
I mean,
2 hours and 40 minutes. Around,
Wow,
around
were we
that.
expecting it to be
really?
this long? We should have made it a two-parter.
Time for blasting away.
It's been long. I mean, to be honest with you, we've held viewership pretty well. Peak was around 60, but it's been pretty consistent around 50 people on the YouTube.
Wow,
And
that's
around 10,
impressive.
Great.
around 10
Yeah.
people on the Discord. So yeah, it's been
Yeah,
I think this till we
fantastic.
count that successful.
Yeah,
Great.
great.
Do we end up with a real lovely little question at the end, or do we just sign off here? What do we think? Anyone?
If anyone's got any, say it now or forever hold your peace. Oh, what? Here we go. One from I am not even going to attempt to pronounce that, but it's a Russian name. It looks like. What % of your projects are finalized in ACEs? I presume that's
Who's
toward
this
you,
to?
Ian. I
To
presume it's
me?
towards you, Ian.
None.
No, I think
mainly do-
ACES is not really aimed at commercial work. It's really, it's where you would really archive features and projects. You know, that's that genre into. Yeah, so it's an archiving, you know, system really.
Yeah, I mean, I shoot content and commercials, so they don't future-proof that like they would a film that was a big budget film shot on, on the, the latest film stock or whatever,
Yeah, yeah. It was created by EMPA, so the Academy out in LA for feature films.
Yeah. Great.
Cindy in the Six just wants to have a quick look at the last slide on the presentation, the summary. David, is that okay?
Yeah, of course. Yes, absolutely. It's good.
I mean, Dave, maybe you could, if anyone wants to have a copy of this, if they send their email.
Well,
in
I'd have to check with Keenaflow,
okay.
only because a lot of the technical graphs come from Frida. So
Right.
hold on, just going backwards.
You can do some screen grabs though, can't you?
Yeah. So that's the main one, and then there's.
I might screen grab that. Just give me a second, actually.
And there's another one after that.
Wait. I'm going to screen grab it. Okay, thanks.
And that's the rest of it.
Good. I'm going to steal that off you now, Dave. Thank you.
No problem. Use it or lose it.
Yeah. Amazing. I think that's. I think we should wrap it up there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks everyone for listening from my part. Thanks, Ian, for having me on.
Yeah, and thanks for coming on, Dave. It's been, for me, absolutely fascinating and certainly deepened my understanding of colour and got me thinking about a few things that I want to try out next. So yeah, I think it was really, really wonderful talk and really very well put together, Dave. So yeah, thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks, Jake, for putting it all together as well.
No worries. Yeah, thank you both for coming. It was really, really informative. A long one, but hopefully a lot of people got a lot of good stuff out of it.
Yeah.
I should just say that I'm doing another talk on Wednesday at 2 o'clock, and I'm going to go through some of my set notes. And what I could do is I could continue some of this talk on colour and show some examples of very early stages, that is, of applying some of this stuff to my content production.
Yeah, we'll be running it the same way. So I know that's already full up with people on the Discord slot, but we'll be running it on YouTube Live again. So that way, if you guys haven't had a chance to sign up, you still can get involved.
Yeah. Please come along. That'll be a good second part to this. Good. Okay. Well,
thanks,
thank
guys.
you, Jake.
Awesome.
Yeah,
thank you, guys.
Dave.
Thanks, everyone.
Right. Thanks, everyone. Yeah. Take care, everyone.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you. It was really good.
Cheers, James.
Yeah. Cheers, James. Thank you.
Ciao. Bye.